Hey everyone. To begin tonight, I'm going to report what I've been reporting from the LA Dodgers. And for those of you new to the show, I've been doing something the last few weeks, a little experiment. So, 5 episodes ago, in episode 19, I talked about how the RBI for most of baseball history has been attributed to one man. Typically, one guy gets all the glory for what really depends on a whole team. If you have guys in front of you who get on base a lot, you'll have a ton of opportunities to drive them in, even if you're just having a so so season, which was the case with Joe Carter in 1990 when he drove in 115 RBI while hitting 232. But Carter had three of the best hitters in the game in front of him. So, what better way to prove this point than to follow a team in 2024 with three of the best on base guys in the league? And they really are. Right now, May 12th, Mookie Betts, Shohei Ohtani, and Freddie Freeman are number 1, number 3, and number 5 in on base percentage in the major leagues. How good is that? So, where are the number 4, 5, and 6 hitters in RBIs? Well, Teoscar Hernandez is tied for number 2 in the majors with 33. And Will Smith and Max Muncy are both tied for number 19 in the majors with 26. And this next stat is just ridiculous. And I don't know if it's happened before in the history of baseball. But right now, the top 6 hitters for the Dodgers are ranked in the top 40 for RBIs in the major leagues, with Freddie Freeman at spot number 38. And if we just look at the National League, they're in the top 20. That's 6 guys from the same team are in the top 20 for RBIs. It's insane. But I'll keep the updates coming. And here's the show. In Josh Leventhal's book, A History of Baseball in 100 Objects, and in Noah Lieberman's book, Glove Affairs, The Romance, History, and Tradition of the Baseball Glove, both authors talk about the history of baseball, or baseball-like sports. For his very first object, Leventhal has a photo of the Gistelli's calendar, and I apologize for the pronunciation. The calendar depicts a figure swinging what looks like a bat, hitting what looks like a ball, and another figure trying to catch the ball. The illustration in this calendar is from the year 1301. From Noah Lieberman, quote, historians say ball games began in Egypt 3 millennia ago. Then they trace an evolution through Middle Eastern fertility rites and European churchyard festivals, right down to Allison's Red Stockings, the first professional baseball team. All those games had balls to catch. By the 1300s, they had bases to run to. But never, until Allison, is there firm evidence that they had gloves. End quote. And the Allison Lieberman's referring to is catcher Doug Allison, who played for the Cincinnati Red Stockings, a team recognized as the first professional team. And this is all to say that in the 1870s, something miraculous happened. After not just decades or centuries, but after millennia, a baseball player swallowed his manliness long enough to slip a piece of cloth over his hand for protection. And America's national pastime changed forever. You're listening to the Midnight Library of Baseball, where there are no loud noises, no jarring music, only nostalgic, thought-provoking, emotional stories about baseball. I'm Ben Orlando. In his book On the Baseball Glove, Noah Lieberman summed it up nicely when he wrote, quote, "The baseball glove began its life in shame," end quote. At the time when Doug Allison and others started experimenting with gloves, this was baseball's dirty little secret, to be kept from the fans at all cost. And the secret was baseball hurts a lot. At least it did for major leaguers in the mid and late 1800s. And considering what Lieberman and Leventhal wrote about the history of the game, baseball and its various iterations have been hurting players for thousands of years. And when I think of professional ball players out in the field, I get this image of a little kid having to go to the bathroom, but told he can't. So he has to stand there in agony while he's torn up inside. This would have been most major league players in the early days, as they stood behind the plate or at first or second base, dreading a hard hit ball that they'd have to field with their bare hands. The internal monologue probably would have been, I wish I had a glove, I wish I had a glove. Or, even more likely, I wish they'd let me wear a glove. And fill in the blank for they. His teammates, his manager, the fans, society. There would have been a lot of theys telling him he couldn't do it. According to Smithsonian writer James Stamp, quote, the measure of a man was the number of calluses on his fingers and of broken bones in his hand, end quote. And it's not just not okay to wear protection, but you're also heralded, cheered on, slapped on the back for your injuries. Calluses, bruises, broken bones, they further cement your position in a group. The more you endure the pain and the agony, the more you belong. And that would be a hard truth to disrupt. At the time, players used a variety of products to harden their hands, like benzoin, which was resin from a balsam tree. In essence, instead of wearing a glove, players tried to turn their hands into gloves, with varied effect. Can you imagine hard-headed players having conversations at the time with logical friends or family, like wives or children? But Danny, don't you need your fingers for living? And this was a time when most ball players, even professionals, had to make a living some other way. And it's pretty hard to make a living or to simply live without your fingers. And yet, for years, ball players sacrificed two of the most important parts of their bodies so that they wouldn't be called sissies, and also so that they'd belong. Today, in the 21st century, you still have stubborn, minimizing, manly men. Sometimes I'm stubborn and dismissive. So what must a stereotypical man from the 19th century been like? Nah, it's okay, honey. It's only a sprain. It's only 3 broken fingers on both hands. I have 3 good fingers left. It's only my pinky sticking out at a right angle. It's okay. It'll heal in 3-4 months after the season's over. And of course, an entire style of play developed around having to field the ball with your fingers. According to one of the premier hitters in the late 19th century, Cap Anson, quote, we had a trick of making a springbox of the fingers, the ball seldom hitting the palm, and we could pull down even the hottest liners that way. Though broken fingers happened now and then, end quote. I think in this quote from Cap Anson, the though in his last phrase speaks volumes. Though broken fingers happened now and then. In describing the consequences of fielding the ball barehanded, Noah Lieberman wrote, quote, when Chicago catcher Silver Flint retired in 1889, he announced that every joint in both fingers had been broken at least once. Irwin, who made padded gloves thinkable, had a pinky that emerged from his hand at a right angle. And Ren Mulford wrote that third baseman Hick Carpenter fielded 7 line drives and it almost tore him apart, end quote. So you can imagine what players were doing consciously or unconsciously to move out of the way of grounders and line drives. In part 1 of this series, writer David Vincent talked about the psychological effect of batters facing a dirty, hard-to-see ball, and how their confidence increased when they knew they were going to see a clean white ball. Here you have the same issue with barehanded fielders. And this brings us back to that question I had in a previous episode. My question was, how are there so many players hitting over 400 in the 1890s? Because you still have the spitballs and the scuffballs, and by 1887, pitchers are no longer pitching the ball where hitters request. which was a thing for 20 years. Now, one explanation why the averages were so high was that in 1894, the pitching box was moved from 50 feet to 60 feet 6 inches, which tired out pitchers. So that's one answer. But there were generally a lot of high batting average in these decades because when you hit the ball, there was a good chance the fielder would make a mistake because he either didn't have a glove or his glove was like something you'd wear to do some gardening or construction. In the days before gloves, there were tons of errors, and there were lots of hits that were classified as hits when they should have been errors. And this is that psychological factor that David Vincent described. Even if you're consciously trying to field the ball cleanly, your unconscious remembers all the bad hops, all the times the ball smashed into a finger or thumb, or ricocheted off your hand into another painful part of your body. It's like somebody trying not to flinch when you fake punch them. It's pretty hard. According to Lieberman, quote, the National Association fielding percentage in 1871, when no one except maybe some catchers wore leather, was .834, which amounted to 8 errors a game, and at least every other run was unearned, end quote. So in 1871, pre-glove, 8 errors per game. By 1901, when all fielders are wearing gloves, that number is down to 2.4 errors per game. By 1908, it's down to 1.71, and by 1919, it's down to 1.43. This is a dramatic decrease. Now, you could make the argument that players became more skilled, there was better training, but it's hard to ignore the influence of baseball gloves. One, because of the benefits the tool brought to fielding, and two, because of the enormous psychological advantage of knowing you could field the ball without worrying about breaking one or more fingers. I mean, talk about peace of mind. Henry Chadwick, the father of baseball, said that gloves had changed the game. Players didn't need tough hands and muscles, which opened the talent pool. He also said, quote, infielders became defter and more aggressive because they didn't have to devote a part of their attention and courage to watching out for their hands, end quote. And from Lieberman, quote, it's impossible to overestimate the effect gloves have had on the game of baseball. Perhaps no innovation has changed the game more, end quote. But even with this praise, Lieberman also questioned why, with so much rapid innovation and improvement because of the glove, it took 90 years to really figure out the glove. What Lieberman is saying is that after 90 years, they finally figured out the baseball glove, where it needed to be. But why did it take 90 years, especially when it didn't have to do with technological advancement? But let's back up a minute and track the evolution of the glove. As previously mentioned, innovation constantly came up against shame. In 1875, infielder Charlie Waite tried to wear flesh-colored gloves, but people still noticed and he, quote unquote, caught hell. It wasn't for another 2 years after Charlie Waite that a ball player summoned the courage to don a pair of gloves. And that man was Albert Spalding, a famous pitcher of the day turned first baseman, and a man who would later become a sporting goods juggernaut. In 1877, Spalding was moving toward business, and it was likely that when he slipped on a pair of black workman's gloves, he was marketing one of his new products, which he quickly began to sell in his catalogs for between $1 and $2.50. By the 1880s, most players were wearing gloves, and some of them, honestly, looked like flattened versions of boxing gloves, like a big oven mitt. And by 1900, the basic glove starts to look like a fingered oven mitt. In 1919, pitcher Bill Doak innovated the glove by adding webbing between the thumb and finger. And this was a huge step forward, but it was still bulky and still had no hinge. It was this globular, fat-fingered mitt with a tiny pocket and maybe a tiny web. By the 20s, 30s, and 40s, the glove was getting a little bigger with a noticeable web, but still no hinge. And by hinge, I mean a certain design of the glove that allowed a player to fold it with one hand, thereby closing the glove around the ball with one hand. For those of you who've been playing for the last 30, 40, 50 years, it might sound strange. But before this point, the glove was not really an extension of the hand. It was just a pad where you trap the ball and then keep it in place with the other hand. Again, this might sound like an obvious innovation, but it did not exist until 1957, when Wilson introduced the A2000. This is the final innovation that Lieberman was referring to, coming close to 90 years after the first baseball glove. As Lieberman explained, the Wilson A2000 did not require state-of-the-art technology, as in some new breakthrough that wasn't possible before. In many ways, it was just as easy to make those gloves from 50, 60 years ago. So why did it take 90 years to create a glove that, according to Lieberman, had no significant flaws, was perfect? The reason, he explained, was that, quote, it took almost 90 years for ball players and glove makers to shake off the belief that the glove must look like the hand, end quote. The Wilson A2000 had thumb and fingers that were thin and flat, compared to previous gloves where the thumb and fingers were fat and round, but still more closely resembling actual fingers and thumbs. The A2000 also had a larger web, and the glove was oriented around an axis that ran diagonally at 40 degrees, which mimicked the hand when it was closed. The problem was that gloves before 1957 were made to resemble a hand that was wide open. They were made to mimic a static object, not one that moved, that opened and closed. And so, of course, in terms of functionality, you're going to get the functionality of an open hand instead of one that can close. The breakthroughs with the Wilson A2000, obvious or not, were enormous. With a functioning hinge and slimmer dimensions, now you didn't need to catch the ball with your glove hand and then trap it in place with your other hand. Now that you can use one hand to do everything, you have, for the first time, full extension and the opportunity for amazing acrobatic catches. A good example of before the A2000 was Willie Mays' famous over-the-shoulder catch in 1954 in the World Series. If you watch the play, you'll see that Mays quickly brings in his second hand. Now, the transfer and throw are so quick, it's hard to tell if he's trapping the ball or simply grabbing it to throw, because he also made an amazing throw. But this was 3 years before the Wilson A2000, so Mays probably would not have trusted his glove to hold the ball on its own. So the designers of the Wilson A2000 had nailed it, to the degree that ball players no longer needed to upgrade. That's pretty impressive. I mean, this was 1957, and according to Lieberman, quote, Kirby Puckett was no older than 7 or 8 when his father brought him the state-of-the-art Wilson A2000. He was still using A2000s when he retired from the game more than 30 years later. Now, Puckett played in the 80s and 90s, and he retired in 1995, almost 40 years after the innovation of the A2000. But really, the genius of the A2000 and gloves that came after was how they moved the action completely away from the hand. If you were fielding the ball correctly, especially in the outfield, the ball would come nowhere near your actual hand, which sat much lower in the glove. The ball would catch in the webbing or between the extended fingers and thumb. For me, what's really interesting is that the technology absolutely existed in 1920, 1900, 1890. The technology to create a thinner, bigger baseball glove similar to the gloves of today. They could have done it. But for close to 100 years, people just didn't think of it. For nearly 100 years, people were stuck in a certain way of thinking. And mind you, some of these people were really trying to innovate. So who knows? Right now, even with all the investment, all the research and glove development, there could be something simple and seemingly obvious that people are overlooking. something that would take this piece of equipment to another level. And of course, you can apply this way of thinking to anything in the world. And there's another angle to consider here as well. Because players were still basically catching the ball in the palms of their hands and using their other hands all the way into the 1950s, you have to wonder about the cost to their hands, to their fingers, and offensive numbers. Near the end of his career, Lou Gehrig, a first baseman, had his hand x-rayed, and the x-ray showed a history of at least 17 fractures. How many players struggled to hit because their hands and fingers were broken and bruised? And how many of the great hitters could have been even better? Maybe Lou Gehrig and other players of his day would have benefited from another kind of glove, the batting glove. If you like the show and crave more content, you can become a Patreon member, where you'll have access to additional audio episodes, video interviews, and other articles and images linked to the show. Go to Patreon/Midnight Library of Baseball. And since this is a one-man production, every bit of support helps. You can donate at midnightlibraryofbaseball.com, and you can add reviews on iTunes and Spotify. Okay, back to the show. According to Tim Wiles, writing for the Baseball Hall of Fame, in 2013, one of the greatest hitters in baseball history, Ichiro Suzuki, walked into the Hall of Fame and asked them if they could tell him about the history of the batting glove. Sure, they told him. We'll put together what we have and we'll send it to you. And he went on his way. So off go the researchers. They went to look and they found that they had nothing. For some reason, this part of baseball history had been ignored. So Tim Wiles and fellow researchers set to work. And they had a hard time tracing the history of the batting glove. As Wiles wrote, quote, "Often the moment of innovation goes unheralded, and nobody writes about the first guy to use batting gloves. But print references start to appear as the practice becomes widespread." End quote. There's an article in the 1932 issue of the Sporting News noting the use of quote-unquote shock absorbers by two players, Lefty O'Doul and Johnny Frederick, both of whom were injured at the time. From Wiles, quote, "Both players adapted with padding. Frederick wrapped his thumb with padding before each at bat, while O'Doul wore an ordinary street glove when facing the pitcher. Interestingly, both players contended that their methods are better than the ordinary sponge usually held onto the handle of the bat with strips of adhesive tape." End quote. Now, that's pretty interesting, and I can't help slipping into the mind of a researcher, just waiting to dig up some gold. I can see them sitting in this dark, dusty archive, flipping through hundreds, if not thousands of pages of books and articles. And then they come across this little nugget, this comment, one sentence, about sponges taped to bats being a normal process. Eureka! To me, it's this insight that I wouldn't have thought of in a million years. Instead of just wearing gloves or some kind of hand protection, hitters tape sponges right to the bat. Again, what were they thinking? But this mention in 1932 is one of the earliest confirmed mentions of batting gloves. After this, a few players were seen using golf gloves while batting, but apparently the big moment for batting gloves occurred in the 1960s. From Tim Wiles, quote, "Ken Harrelson is often credited with bringing the batting glove into the regular season, specifically on September 4th, 1964, in Kansas City. Golf again was the inspiration, as Harrelson reportedly spent a long day on the links, blistering his hands, and used his red golf glove to protect them a bit in that evening's game, in which he homered twice. Mickey Mantle bought 20 pairs of red golf gloves the next day." End quote. Now, it's interesting how, while Mickey Mantle, clearly no sissy, ordered a bunch of gloves and started wearing them, his team, the Yankees, mocked Ken Harrelson mercilessly the next day, calling him Sweetheart and Mrs. Harrelson for wearing batting gloves. And as late as the 1980s, there was still this stigma around wearing batting gloves. George Brett famously said, "I ain't no sissy," regarding his not wearing batting gloves. Of course, Brett used pine tar instead, which led to the famous pine tar incident. Also, Mel Hall, another MLB player, said, quote, "I don't wear gloves. Gloves are for women," end quote. Then you have ball player Dale Berra, who said in 1983, quote, "My hands are so sore I can't hold a bat, and I wear gloves. I don't know how the old timers did it before anybody used batting gloves," end quote. I love Berra's quote because it highlights the unbelievable amount of pain ball players must have been experiencing during the early days of baseball. I mean, Berra's talking about being in a lot of pain while wearing batting gloves, while wearing the latest fielding glove, while having more comfortable accommodations and more comfortable travel, while making more money and having more time to rest and recover. And I know I mentioned this before, but it's worth mentioning again. When we compare the greats of today to the greats of the past, we don't tend to think of all the differences. Lou Gehrig had 17 hand fractures. Babe Ruth played with a tiny outfielder's mitt and wore no batting gloves. And he still did what he did. But this thing, this baseball glove, the fielder's glove, that is, went from a shameful addition to a cherished personal item. As Noah Lieberman wrote, quote, "Except for maybe his protective cup, a major leaguer spends more time with his glove than with anything else he owns." End quote. There are so many great stories, not only about major league players and their gloves, but just people and their baseball gloves. In an old Sports Illustrated piece from 1990, Steve Wolf brings together many glove stories, like President George Bush keeping his 45-year-old mitt in the drawer of his Oval Office desk, or Pirates Gold Glover Bill Mazeroski, who remembered digging an outhouse hole to earn his first glove from his uncle. Another Gold Glover, Dwight Evans, who played many years for the Red Sox, said of his first glove, which was a Don Demeter Spalding, quote, "I can still see it. I can still feel it. I wish I still had it." End quote. During the interview, Evans went on to say, quote, "A good glove is like a wife. I really feel that way. Uh-oh, my wife just heard me say that and gave me this look. You know what I mean, honey." End quote. From Steve Wolf, quote, "It's a magical thing, the mitt. Hundreds of thousands are made every year, yet each one is special to the hand it winds up marrying. Try not to choke on this line. You can't spell glove without love. The next time you're in a sporting goods store, stand by the baseball glove rack for a while, and sure enough, you'll see some guy sidle over, try on a glove or three, smile, and walk away. He's not shopping. He's remembering." End quote. And a large part of this connection is the time and energies players put into caring for their gloves. And back in the day, it was quite a feat to work your mitt into shape. According to Lieberman, quote, "Breaking in a baseball glove used to be a violent affair. Hot water, cold water, steam, hot air, tobacco spit, baseball bats, scissors, knives, and other gruesome means have been employed by major leaguers." End quote. From reporter Will Wedge, writing in 1925, quote, "The Yankees are fortunate in having one of the best glove doctors in the majors. He is Charlie O'Leary. He can take a glove that is inclined to buck and shy at grounders and break it in like a western cowboy and rodeo rider would break in a bad-tempered bronco. He takes gloves apart and rebuilds them nearer the heart's and fingers' desire. He unlaces the new glove and amputates excess padding. He puts Vaseline on the inside of the glove and manipulates it until it is pliable. But it's really the way Charlie talks to a glove and discusses things with it that makes it the dapper and well-groomed object it becomes when he is finished with it." End quote. Even though materials have changed since 1925 and glove design has changed, there's still quite a ritual today in breaking in your glove, and no one method fits all. According to Billy Witz, writing for the New York Times in 2015, quote, "Some break them in by dunking them in water or placing them in a microwave oven. Some lather them with shaving cream. Others beat them with a mallet as if tenderizing a steak. Still others stick a baseball or two in their gloves, wrap them with twine, and stick them beneath their mattress for a few weeks. For some, the breaking in process lasts a matter of days. For many, it can be an entire year before they take the field with a glove that fits, well, like a glove." End quote. Now, when it comes to baseball gloves and cheating, you of course have a history of pitchers trying to conceal Vaseline or pine tar or other sticky substances in their glove. And for a while, the regulations for the size of a glove were not enforced. Steve Wolf, writing in 1990, said that until that year, a 40-year rule was not enforced, and that rule said that a glove could not be longer than 12 inches or wider than 7 3/4 inches. One example of players getting away with what they could was outfielder Luis Polonia. According to Mariners manager Jim Lefebvre, quote, "Polonia's glove was so big he could use it for a shopping basket. He could put 3 dozen eggs, a pound of ham, some vegetables in it, and still have enough room to get lost." End quote. Players were apparently stretching the length to as much as 15 inches before the commissioner, Fay Vincent, cracked down. Now, one of the most famous glove cheating scandals involves a legacy family and a potato. In 1987, minor league catcher Dave Bresnahan came up with the idea to pull a fast one on the opposing team using an oversized catcher's mitt and a potato. You'll hear the name Bresnahan in my upcoming episode on catcher's equipment because Roger Bresnahan, Dave's great uncle, was a trailblazing major league catcher in the early days of the 20th century. But in 1987, Dave Bresnahan wasn't thinking about legacy. He was just bored after a long season in Double-A, mostly riding the bench. The full story comes from journalist Matt Monaghan, writing for MLB.com. Quote, "One day before heading into a series against the Reading Phillies, the self-described different out-of-the-box guy had a very different out-of-the-box idea. I thought, what if we snuck maybe a rosin bag, or for some reason, maybe because I'm Irish, a potato, into the game," Bresnahan recalled. "It was just talk, but then it got picked up the next day, and my teammates thought it was funny. They said, 'Well, why don't you do it?'" End quote. So Dave Bresnahan, bored and egged on by his teammates, began planning his scheme. He even consulted with a major league umpire who happened to be a friend of his. He was trying to gauge what kind of reaction he'd get from the umpire. And Bresnahan's friend said it wouldn't be a big deal. The umpire would probably just call a do-over. So everyone on the team knew what Bresnahan was going to do. Everyone except his manager, Orlando Gomez, who'd been demoted in the middle of the season from the Triple-A team to Bresnahan's Double-A team. And Gomez was not happy about it. Bresnahan knew his manager would probably be pissed, but he moved forward with the plan anyway. And just to note, one other teammate who wasn't totally aware of the scheme was outfielder Miguel Roman. Bresnahan's plan was to wait until there was a runner on third base with 2 outs. Then he'd throw a wild throw to the third baseman using a potato, and the runner would take advantage and run home, with Dave Bresnahan and the actual baseball waiting for him. In preparation for the prank, Bresnahan had peeled and shaped several potatoes to look like baseballs, or as much as a potato can look like a baseball. When the moment finally arrived, Bresnahan told the home plate umpire that his glove broke and he had to get his replacement. This is when he went to the dugout and grabbed the new glove and the potato. Meanwhile, his teammates sat in the dugout cracking up. From writer Matt Monaghan, quote, "So my heart's beating. I can't believe I'm doing this. I'm committed," Bresnahan said. I pick up the ball and I'm supposed to make a bad throw to third. Rob Swain's playing third, and he knows what to do. But I make a good throw, Bresnahan said. The guy who was running was about 6'5", Bresnahan said. So if he hadn't dove back, the potato would have exploded on his helmet or back. He did, though, and Swain made an alligator arm attempt at catching the potato. It sailed into the outfield, splitting into pieces once it hit the ground. Left fielder Miguel Roman, who wasn't totally in on the gang, looked shocked at what he'd just witnessed. The runner got up, and the third base coach was screaming, "Score!" Bresnahan said. He was running home at about three-quarters effort because it was an easy home plate run. Right before he touched home, the ball was in my glove, and I tagged him out. I showed it to the ump and rolled it to the mound. That's, of course, when all the confusion happened. The third base umpire had gone out to retrieve the biggest piece. He came back and he said, "It's a potato." End quote. Apparently, the home plate umpire that day was being supervised, so he wasn't thrilled that this prank had occurred on his watch. He and his fellow umpires conferred and decided to count the run and let the inning continue. And Bresnahan's manager, Orlando Gomez, was pissed and thought Bresnahan's prank was meant to solely piss off Gomez. 2 days later, Dave Bresnahan was released, or fired, from the team. But he wasn't bitter. He was about done with baseball at this point anyway, and went into real estate. There are so many interesting stories about players and their baseball gloves, like 1950s infielder Buddy Peterson, who tied a rope around his glove and led it around like a dog, and who punished it and told it to behave when it wasn't working for him. Or Brewers outfielder Rick Manning, who would, quote, pretend that the R insignia on the back of his Rawlings was the button on a vacuum. So before he went onto the field, he always pressed the button. He would say, "Kid, make sure your vacuum's on." End quote. For many people, professionals and non-professionals, there's a deep emotional connection to a baseball glove. And for one final story, I'm going to quote a section from Dwyer Brown's book, If You Build It, a book about fathers, fate, and Field of Dreams. And if that name Dwyer Brown rings a bell, it's because Brown is the actor who played Kevin Costner's father in Field of Dreams. And in this section of his book, which is fantastic and made me cry a half dozen times, Dwyer is in a van with some crew on their way to the Iowa farm where they're filming Field of Dreams. Quote, "My hand brushed against the old mitt I had brought from my parents' house for luck. I pulled it out of the bag. The worn leather felt soft and cool in my grip. It had only a single leather shoelace strung between the thumb and forefinger for webbing. The big guy sitting next to me woke up inexplicably and tried to focus his bleary eyes on the swollen glove that was in my hand. 'Is that from the prop department?' he asked. 'No,' I said. 'It's my dad's mitt from when he was a kid.' I held it up for him to see. 'Cool,' the man said. 'He must be excited for you to be working on a baseball movie. My dad is stoked.' 'Mine too,' I said before I realized it. This was not the first time I had pretended my dad was still alive, but it surprised me nonetheless. It had only been a month since he died, and I could not get used to the fact that I would never see him again. I turned his mitt over in my hand. My father had taught my brother and me to catch with this mitt. It looked like a tan leather version of one of Mickey Mouse's gloves, rather than a modern mitt. We got pretty good at catching with both hands, but it was tedious to have to share the old split-finger glove. So it was a big day when we took our saved allowances to buy baseball mitts at Sears. Before we went to bed, Dad brought out the saddle soap from the family shoe shine kit and showed us how to use it to soften the leather. My brother and I took turns sleeping with the baseball in the glove, shoved under our pillow, to help it form into the perfect basket. To this day, the creamy smell of saddle soap has a mildly sedative effect on me." End quote. That's the end of the show, and I hope those of you in bed, ready to hit the hay, have your own fond memories of baseball gloves and what they meant to you. Good night. I'd love to hear what you think about this topic, so please share your thoughts on Instagram at Midnight Library of Baseball. You can also go to my website, midnightlibraryofbaseball.com. You can go to Facebook or at the many platforms hosting a podcast. You can also send me an email at midnightlibraryofbaseball@gmail.com. And if you like the show, please leave a review on iTunes or wherever you listen. And feel free to donate on Podbean or at my website. The music is A Long Way by Sergei Pavkin at Pixabay.